The chapel is completely dark. It is nearly midnight. A young nun kneels alone at the communion rail, her arms stretched wide in the shape of a cross, her lips moving in the ancient prayers of an angel. She has been kneeling this way for more than an hour. Outside the convent walls, the town of Tuy, Spain, sleeps in the June heat. The year is 1929. And then the darkness ends. If you have stayed with this channel for any length of time, you already know that the Fatima story does not end in 1917. The three shepherd children who saw Our Lady in the fields of Portugal were not simply visited once and then left alone. The messages continued, deepened, and pressed with increasing urgency toward a single, specific act that heaven claimed would change the course of history. What happened to the last surviving visionary on the night of June 13, 1929, is one of the most extraordinary and least understood episodes in the entire Fatima record. And if you have never heard it described in full, what follows may be the most important 12 minutes you spend this week. If this kind of careful investigation matters to you, staying with this channel is one small way to make sure it continues. Her name was Lucia dos Santos. She was the oldest of the three Fatima children, the only one of the three who lived to adulthood, and by 1929 she was a young nun in a Dorothean convent in Tuy, a Spanish city near the Portuguese border on the banks of the Minho River. She had received permission from her confessor and her superiors to spend a holy hour in the chapel on certain nights, from 11 in the evening until midnight. These were solitary hours. No other sisters were present. She knelt and prayed in the darkness and the silence, her arms extended, and she carried within her the weight of things she had seen as a child in those fields that most of the world still did not fully understand. On that particular June night, everything changed. The chapel filled with light.
For 400 years they kept this sealed. We gathered every prophecy they tried to bury into one book, written plainly, nothing hidden, nothing softened. If you want the whole truth, not the version they approved, it's pinned in the top comment. Get it tonight.
Not candlelight, not the flicker of lamps. Something beyond natural explanation poured into the space. And in that light, on the altar, a cross appeared. It rose from the altar all the way to the ceiling, and it was made not of wood, but of light itself. At the top of the cross, a face could be seen, a man from the waist up, and on his chest, a dove, equally luminous. These, in the symbolic language of sacred vision, represented the Father and the Holy Spirit. And nailed to the cross, the body of another man, the Son. The full mystery of the Trinity, displayed in one image, hovering in light above the altar of a small convent chapel in northern Spain, while a lone nun knelt and shook. Below the waist of the crucified figure, suspended in the air, there was a chalice and a large host. Drops of blood fell from the face of the crucified one, from the wound in his side, and those drops fell upon the host and ran down into the chalice beneath. This was not simply a vision of heaven. This was a vision of the Mass itself, of what the Church teaches happens at every altar, when bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. The Tuy vision seemed to collapse the distance between time and eternity, to show the eternal sacrifice as the ground from which everything else would flow. And then, beneath the right arm of the luminous cross, Our Lady appeared. She was recognizable from the earlier apparitions. She held her Immaculate Heart, but there was a difference. No roses, no sword. Instead, her heart was surrounded by a crown of thorns and encircled by flames. It was the image that had been shown years before, in the very first of the Fatima appearances, the image of a heart suffering and burning. But now it was not accompanied by the beautiful serenity of those early visions. There was grief in this image, and urgency, and she spoke. The words attributed to her in this moment, recorded in Lucia's own accounts and transcribed by her spiritual director, Father José Bernardo Goncalves of the Society of Jesus, were preserved and later included in what became known as Lucia's memoirs. They have been studied, quoted, disputed, and carried in the hearts of millions of Catholics for nearly a century. Our Lady said, "The moment has come in which God asks the Holy Father to make, In union with all the bishops of the world, the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart, promising to save it by this means. Pause there for a moment, because those words contain a very specific structure, not a vague invitation, not a general plea for prayer. A named nation, Russia. A named act, consecration. A named condition, the Holy Father, together with all the bishops of the world, doing this together in the same moment as one body. And a named promise that by this means Russia would be saved. Lucia reported that she was also shown other things during the TUI vision, things she described as mysteries she was not permitted to disclose. The interior dimensions of the experience.
If your heart is heavy, that feeling is a grace, but don't stop at fear. We wrote the prayers to answer it. The rosary, the consecration, the protection for you and the ones you love. Don't face what's coming unprepared. It's pinned in the top comment. Get it tonight.
Went beyond what she wrote down. But the external request, the part she was able and clearly instructed to communicate, she communicated with precision. She wrote it down. She sent it to her superiors. She pressed it forward through the institutional channels available to her. She wrote letters. She received further interior communications in the 1930s in which she reported, both Our Lord and Our Lady expressed disappointment that the consecration had not yet been done. And here the story becomes complicated, because the question of what happened next, whether the popes who followed acted, and whether those actions counted, is not a settled matter. It is, in fact, one of the most actively contested questions in contemporary Catholic piety, and this channel will not pretend otherwise. Pope Pius XII consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in 1942, and specifically mentioned Russia in a radio broadcast in 1952. Many who venerate Fatima regard these as partial responses, sincere but incomplete, because they were not performed in explicit union with all the bishops of the world as the request specified. Then came 1984 and the pontificate of John Paul II. On March 25th of that year, in a ceremony in Rome, the Polish Pope performed an act of consecration that was accompanied by letters sent to bishops around the world inviting their participation. The act was sincere and carefully prepared, but it did not mention Russia by name, and it was not performed simultaneously, in a single moment, with bishops gathered in the same rite. What followed was a controversy that has never fully ended. On one side, there are those who point to statements attributed to Lucia herself in the years after 1984, in which she reportedly confirmed that the consecration had been accomplished as Our Lady requested. Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, in his later communications, cited Sister Lucia directly. Yes, it has been performed, as Our Lady requested, on March 25, 1984. Those who hold this position look at the subsequent history of Russia, the fall of the Soviet Union, the opening of churches, the apparent end of communist persecution of the faithful, and see in those events the promised fruits of a consecration that heaven accepted. On the other side, there are serious Catholic scholars and institutions, including the Fatima Center, founded to promote the original message, who argue that the 1984 ceremony did not meet the explicit conditions set by Our Lady in 1929. No explicit mention of Russia, no simultaneous worldwide action of the bishops, and the evidence they present regarding Lucia's own statements is contested on both sides. They point to a world that, whatever openings occurred in the 1990s, has not seen anything resembling the peace that was promised. They point to Russia's actions in Ukraine, to ongoing suffering, to the sense that whatever happened in 1984, it was not the fulfillment. Then came March 25, 2022. Pope Francis, in the midst of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, performed a consecration of Russia and Ukraine together, with explicit mention of both nations by name, and with bishops around the world invited to join the ceremony simultaneously. For many faithful Catholics, this was significant, perhaps the most literal response to the 1929 request that any pope had yet attempted. For others, the inclusion of Ukraine alongside Russia meant the act was still not specific enough, and the collegial nature of the bishops' participation remained disputed. Even this consecration did not silence the debate. If anything, the eruption of war in that same year deepened the sense among many that the message of Tui had still not been fully honored. This is where honesty requires a kind of humility. The disagreement is real. Both sides have serious arguments. What can be said without controversy is that the 1929 vision at Tui, the documented request transcribed by a Jesuit spiritual director from Lucia's own notes, specified something concrete, and that the concrete question of whether it has been done remains genuinely open among devout Catholics who have studied it carefully. This channel does not claim to resolve that question. What it does claim is that the question deserves to be carried carefully, without sensationalism, without fabrication, and without the kind of certainty that honest examination does not permit. Which brings us to the present moment. In May of 2025, the conclave that followed the death of Pope Francis elected Robert Francis Prevost, who took the name Leo XIV. He is the first American pope in the history of the Church, a man formed in the Augustinian order and in the pastoral realities of Peru. Within days of his election, he offered a prayer of consecration to Our Lady of Fatima, a gesture that was noted across the Catholic world and that drew immediate attention from those who have been waiting, sometimes for decades, for a new pope to take the Tui request seriously. Whether that early gesture indicates an intention to address the specific question of Russia's consecration in the manner the 1929 vision prescribed is, as of this recording, unknown. It is speculation to say more than that, but the speculation is not nothing. A new pontificate carries new possibilities, and there are Catholics around the world who believe that the window opened by Leo XIV's evident Marian devotion is precisely the kind of opening that history has not always provided. Here is what does not require speculation. The night of June 13, 1929 happened. A young woman knelt alone in a dark chapel in Spain and reported that the darkness was replaced by something she could not have invented: a cross of light, a chalice catching sacred blood, the full mystery of the Trinity made somehow visible, and a woman in grief who spoke about a nation and a promise and a pope. Lucia wrote it down. Her confessor preserved it. It was examined, incorporated into the Fatima record, and passed forward through decades of the Church's history. Whether heaven's promise attached to that request has been fulfilled or waits still to be fulfilled is a question the living must carry. But the record itself, the pre-controversy, pre-conflict account of what a young Dorothean nun saw and heard on a June night almost a century ago, that record is not in dispute. There is something in that undisputed record that the late hour and the quietness of this channel's audience is well suited to receive. The Tui vision was not given in a stadium, not announced from a throne. It was given to a woman alone in darkness. To one soul, prostrate, arms in the shape of a cross, praying the prayers of an angel. The way heaven chose to deliver what it called the most urgent request of the century was the same way it has always operated. Quietly, to those willing to stay awake a little longer than the rest of the world, to those who have not yet gone home to sleep. You are watching this at night. You already know something about staying awake. The story of Tui is not over. It has never been over. Whatever was done in 1984, whatever was done in 2022, the faithful who carry this message have never stopped returning to those exact words from that June night. The moment has come. God asks, the Holy Father, in union with all the bishops of the world. Russia. The Immaculate Heart. A promise attached to a specific act. And a young nun who stayed awake long enough to receive it. What that means for today, for a new pontificate, for a world in which Russia and Ukraine have been in open war, and in which the geopolitical landscape Our Lady described has pressed itself into every headline, that is something each faithful Catholic must carry in prayer. This channel will keep bringing forward the anchored record, the documented, traceable, pre-controversy account of what was seen and what was asked, without distortion, without certainty where certainty is not warranted, and without the sensationalism that this story does not need. Because the story, on its own, is extraordinary enough. The chapel in Tui still stands. The chapel where a nun knelt alone in the dark, and the darkness became light, where drops of blood fell into a chalice, where a heart surrounded by thorns held itself out in silence and spoke about the salvation of a nation. 97 years ago. And the question it posed has still not been put fully to rest.